Good afternoon, my name is Mike Abbott, and this is my informative speech for Communications A111. And the topic of my speech is the history of the electric bass. Now, since the invention of the electric bass, there have been countless bassists who have worked tirelessly to bring their instrument to the front and center of their particular genres. Guys like Paul McCartney, Sting, Les Claypool, Victor Wooten, Marcus Miller, Esperanza Spalding, and all of these individuals have achieved worldwide success playing their instrument, yet there's still an underappreciation for the bass. And I think it's because of a lack of knowledge. And that, a lot of people think that the bass guitar is nothing more than an electric guitar minus two strings, which couldn't be further from the truth. So that's the purpose of this speech today, is just to give you guys a little bit of background information, a little bit of knowledge, if you will, about the bass. We're going to start off with its history as the upright bass and what its role was and how that role and its changing role inspired others to pursue a different avenue from the upright bass to the electric bass, who invented the electric bass guitar, and then we're going to talk about who perfected the electric guitar. In the late 1890s, early 1900s, the jazz bands in New Orleans were more like marching bands. They didn't even have a stringed bass in the band. They used a tuba to play the bass lines because they were marching up and down the streets. You can't carry around an upright bass and play walking bass lines all day. It's just not going to happen. It wasn't until the early 1900s, whenever they relocated these bands from the streets into the bars and brothels in New Orleans, where the tuba was sat down and the upright bass was utilized. Now, the purpose of the bass guitar in these early jazz bands and in, country music of the time, folk music of the time, bluegrass, and even music today, its primary purpose is to hold the rhythm, hold down the beat, and to help outline the harmonies. So a prime example of this is going to be your country bass line. It's like what we'd hear in an old polka kind of line, the bump, 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 bump. That bass line does everything that a bass line is supposed to do. It holds down the time, and the notes that you play outline the chords that are being played by everybody else. Holds time, outlines the harmony. As simple as that. And in fact, it seemed like the bass was going to be doomed to this simple role, because of the fact that as everything else was getting louder, you had trumpets, more trumpets getting added to the mix. Keep in mind, we're coming into the big band era here, the 1920s, 1930s. And, you got 10 trumpets, good luck keeping up as a bass player with an upright bass, an unamplified upright bass. It's not going to happen. And as guitars at that time were starting to get amplified, the bass started falling behind. And it was such a large instrument as well. I mean, it stood over 6 feet high. They still stand over 6 feet high. And, the base of them was about 3 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep at its deepest. It was a monstrosity of an instrument. And the size issue, in fact, was the primary reason that Paul Tutmark decided to pursue trying to invent the electric bass guitar, because he felt bad for the bass player, because the rest of the band that he toured with was able to fit in one car and able to go out and hang out and have fun on the road, while the bass player was stuck in a totally separate car, because by the time he put his bass in there, no room for anybody else. So compassion was actually the mother of invention for the electric bass guitar. But Mr. Tutmark invented the electric bass guitar in 1933 by Audiovox Manufacturing, and it was referred to as the bass fiddle. Now, even though its name says bass fiddle, it was not shaped like a fiddle at all. In fact, it had the horizontal playing style. It had more of a teardrop face bass to it as far as the body goes, but it was a fretted instrument as opposed to the upright bass, which was a fretless instrument. And it had the magnetic pickup in it, which solved the problem as far as trying to amplify the acoustic sounds of the electric bass. But the main problem is that at that point in time, bass amplification wasn't where it needed to be. He was ahead of his time, and unfortunately that was the fall of his instrument. It never received any market success at all, and it only lasted about a year, and then it was a done deal. Until 1951, whenever Leo Fender and his co-worker George Fullerton invented the Fender Precision bass. Now, this bass answered all the problems that had been presented from the upright bass. It was small. It had the magnetic pickups in it, and the timing was great too, because at that point the amplification of low-frequency instruments was starting to catch up with the higher frequency amplification. So this P bass, or the precision bass, was now able to push and get through all of the other instruments that were being amplified. Now, it sounds like a godsend, this P bass does, but it did not really take over as the primary instrument from the upright bass until the 1960s and 1970s. And that was summed up by Keith Richards, who was quoted in Chris Gissy's book, How the Fender Bass Changed the World. When asked about, rock and roll and what he thought about it, Keith Richards replied, something had changed, and I realized that it was the bass. And we should take the word of the guy who was one of the kings of rock and roll during his time period, Keith Richards with the Rolling Stones, that the bass guitar did in fact change how rock and roll was played and how rock and roll was listened to. So from its humble beginnings as the upright bass in the jazz bands of New Orleans, to the people who strived to take the bass a step further, through amplification, through making it smaller, more versatile, easier to handle, easier to take with them, to the guy who actually invented the bass, Mr. Paul Tutmark, with no success, but paved the way for the future, which is Leo Fender and George Fullerton. This has been a history of the electric bass, and appreciate it. Keep your groove on.